I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently in Burlington, which is part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. IISD's work in climate risk management in developing countries and Canada aims to help decision makers devise policies and programs that will be sustainable over the longer term. The work of the resilience team also has helped to strengthen the role of adaptation efforts in advancing peace building and gender equality. Sustainable finance is also a long-standing area of focus for IISD. Our research in this area identifies and promotes the broader structural reforms needed for the financial system and sector to deliver on sustainable development. The research that we are currently carrying out with Idrc on finance for adaptation brings together IISD's work on adaptation and sustainable finance. The project, called Mobilizing Development Finance for Adaptation, is being implemented in partnership with research organizations based in Kenya, Nepal, and Peru. Today's webinar explores the question lying at the core of this joint research project. How can we scale up finance for adaptation in ways that are strongly aligned with country-defined adaptation needs? I would now like to call on Erin Tanzi, Director of IDRC's Sustainable Inclusive Economies Program, to provide some opening remarks.
Thanks so much, Anne. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. On behalf of the International Development Research Center, IDRC, I would just like to also welcome you to this webinar today. For those of you who may have missed Anne, and the title of the webinar is called "Informing National Government Efforts to Scale Up Finance for Adaptation: Where to Next?" So, just as a bit of background, as we know, climate change and climate finance is key to driving innovation and supporting ambitious adaptation action in the Global South. UNEP, the UN Environment Program in 2016, estimated that the cost of adaptation is set to increase from about $140 billion to $300 billion annually by 2030, with the potential of an increase up to almost $500 billion by 2050. The Paris Agreement agreed to the goal of mobilizing or jointly mobilizing $100 billion per year by developed countries and to address climate-related financial needs of developing countries. The Green Climate Fund and other international finance institutions, such as the multilateral development banks, are trying to increase the flow of finance by leveraging private sector or private investment for adaptation with public resources to meet the adaptation challenges in the Global South. However, several knowledge gaps exist in this area. Knowledge gaps such as information around what counts as adaptation or resilience investment, national strategies for aligning national adaptation plans and or nationally determined contributions to development financing requirements, a lack of innovative financing instruments specific to adaptation, and how mainstreaming adaptation into development financing actually helps to leverage private sector investment in adaptation. So this webinar, as Anne mentioned, will draw on an ongoing IDRC supported project called Mobilizing Development Finance for Strategic and Scaled Up Investment in Climate Adaptation, which is implemented by IISD together with partners from 3 countries, from Kenya at the Africa Center for Technology Studies, from Nepal, the Prakriti Resource Center, and from Peru with Libulela. So the webinar is also going to discuss the preliminary results of this research, and we'll talk about some of the challenges related to 3 things. The first one is the challenge related to integrating or mainstreaming climate adaptation into development finance. The second one is about the barriers faced by international development finance institutions in scaling up finance for adaptation within their finance portfolios. And the third one is the challenges developing countries face in attracting adaptation finance, particularly from the NDBs. So I look forward to listening to our partners from these 3 countries as to how they are addressing adaptation finance gaps, as climate change is one of the greatest challenges of our time So I have no doubt that today will be a very productive day. We'll all learn a lot, and I'm sure that this project has a really big potential to contribute to the policy debate in these three countries and beyond. So I wish you a very productive discussion, and I'll be listening in. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Erin, and welcome to our presenter, moderator, panel members, and everyone in attendance. So today we're going to be examining developing country government efforts to scale up financing for adaptation. The opening presentation will elaborate on the Adaptation Finance Gap and review the challenges and barriers that impede the scaling up of finance to address that gap in developing countries. We will discuss ways to address these barriers with our discussions stimulated by examples from Peru, Nepal, and Kenya. Today's event is intended to be interactive with a focus on sharing information. Following the scene-setting presentation and interventions from our panel members, there will be an open discussion led by you, the participants. We encourage you to share comments, offer examples of developing country governments' efforts to scale up finance for adaptation, and to use this opportunity to inform participants of ongoing research and initiatives that are helping developing countries address their adaptation finance gap. We're using Padlet to facilitate this information sharing. You can access Padlet at the link posted by Julia in the chat or here on the screen. That's www.bit.ly/Padlet526. You will see that Padlet includes a column that allows you to introduce yourself and your organization, another for suggesting relevant resources, one for you to ask questions, and another that encourages you to share comments or start a discussion. If you would like to make an intervention during the open discussion, make it known in Padlet or use the raise your hand function in Zoom so we can unmute your microphone. If you prefer not to speak, simply type in your question into Padlet and we will read it aloud. We will try to get every question and comment. So with that, we're going to start the webinar with a scene-setting presentation by Deborah Murphy, who is a senior associate with IISD. Deborah, we are looking forward to hearing from you and about some of the key issues related to the adaptation finance gap and efforts in developing countries to address this gap.
Thank you, Anne. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I understand we have participants joining us from multiple time zones, so welcome to all of you. My name is Deborah Murphy. I am a senior associate with IISD, and I'm pleased to be here today to speak with you on this important topic of scaling up finance for adaptation. Next slide, please. It'll be a short scene-setting presentation where we'll first look at the adaptation finance gap. Then I'll explore some of the challenges and barriers to scaling up finance for adaptation in developing countries. And then I'll provide some insights on closing that gap, providing some initial learning from our research project that you've heard we're carrying out in cooperation with three Southern partners and with support from Idrc. And then what will happen is our panel will elaborate on some of those solutions for closing the gap. Next slide. This figure, just to start off, we'll start to look at the adaptation finance gap. This is a figure from the Green Climate Fund, their independent evaluation unit, and it draws on OECD and climate policy initiative data. A little complicated, but I thought it was quite interesting if we look sort of at the lower right part of the chart. I mean, what it shows us is that the gap in climate finance is large for both mitigation and adaptation, but it's particularly large, acute for adaptation. So we see down at the bottom that the adaptation flows, finance flows, an average for 2017, 2018, averaged about 27 billion per year. Now, this is only 7% of the total climate finance flows of 357 billion, and that's flows from both OECD and non-OECD countries, so domestic finance. And of that 27 billion, That's only about 12% of the estimated global need for adaptation of around 220 billion. Aaron just mentioned the UNEP Adaptation Gap report, which puts the need at about 140 to 300 billion per year to 2030, an average of 220 billion per year. But the point being that the adaptation gap is large. Next slide. This chart also is from the GCF Independent Evaluation Unit. I just wanted to show that for 2018, 2017, there has been slight increases in the amount of finance that's flowing for adaptation, but most of that comes from bilateral agencies and from multilateral development banks. The banks are shown in gray in this chart, the bilateral agreements in green. So we are seeing increases in adaptation flowing through these organizations. The red shows climate finance or climate funds, and those are funds that flow through the financial mechanism of the UNFCCC or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So that's the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, the Least Developed Countries Fund, the Global Environment Facility. So that's a relatively small amount of the flows that developing countries use for adaptation. But it's important because a lot of it is grants and a lot of it tries innovative pilot approaches. The yellow, which you might see a little yellow line at the bottom of the 2018 column, is the amount of funds through private donors. So this is private finance that is mobilized by public funds. And as noted, this is very low for adaptation. So in the case of the GCF, private donors actually accounted for less than 2% of total amounts for adaptation only projects. So the amount is very low. And I think an important point to bring out, which we see sort of more so on the earlier slide, was that domestic public finance plays a very large role in financing adaptation in developing countries. Next slide, please. I needed to point out, I think, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on adaptation finance because it has had a real impact. A recent report from the Global Center on Adaptation shows that that adaptation finance actually fell in the last year in 2020, a result of the pandemic. Many governments face competing priorities for their scarce public dollars. So they've had increases in emergency spending and health spending. They've had reductions in tax revenues and remittances. And many of these countries have oncoming debt payments as a result of COVID-19 spending. The NAP Global Network, which is managed by IISD, has determined that there's been considerable disruption in adaptation planning as a result of COVID-19. I think we're all aware it's been very difficult to engage stakeholders over the past year. There's distracted support for adaptation, with other seeming priorities, and there's greater competition for adaptation finance. Next slide, please. But we know, for example, that investing in adaptation makes sense. The Global Commission on Adaptation has reported, they did a big report, I think it was 2019, the overall rate of return on investments and improved resilience is very, very high, with benefit cost ratios ranging from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1. So the case for adaptation is clear, but there remains an adaptation gap. And most of this stems from the fact that the upfront costs of adaptation can be significant. Studies show that the extra cost to build climate resilience into power and transport infrastructure is about 3% of the investment needs. For other types of projects, it can be as high as 10 to 20%. So these are significant amounts of money that need to be brought in at the upfront stage of project planning. On top of that, many adaptation investments do not generate revenue streams to cover the added costs of addressing climate risk. And this can make adaptation less attractive to the private sector. Very often adaptation investments are made to avoid costs, such as, making a community or a society more resilient to extreme weather events. And often the benefits take place only in the long term. And then we see that many adaptation investments are investments in public good. And so it is difficult to leverage that private investment. Next slide, please. So along with the upfront costs, there are also many challenges and barriers, and Erin pointed some of those out in her opening points. There's often a lack of knowledge of the benefits of adaptation. It can be difficult to convince policymakers to make this investment because it's a long-term investment often, and the benefits are not always immediately obvious. And often there's a lack of knowledge within the ministries of finance. So while your ministries of environment or your ministries of climate change are very aware of the importance of adaptation, this isn't always well known across other ministries. The lack of data, the lack of technical expertise to assess climate vulnerabilities and risks, contributes to this lack of knowledge. And as noted before, accounting for adaptation is challenging. So, counting adaptation finance is difficult. There's no standard format for developing countries to report on climate finance. And then added to that, measuring adaptation outcomes can be particularly difficult. And we have a real need for climate resilience metrics to demonstrate outcomes and the impacts of spending on adaptation. For example, how does adaptation finance contribute to achieving both the global goal on adaptation as well as developing countries' adaptation goals as set out in their NDCs, their nationally determined contribution, or in the NAP national adaptation plans? Measuring adaptation is complex because the progress made in adaptation is incremental, it's context specific, and the benefits of resilience are measured differently across sectors. Next slide, please. So how do we close that finance gap? There's a lot of positive steps taking place. And one of those positive steps is recognition at a high level and commitments made at a high level. The Paris Agreement is one example where it does state that scaled up financial resources should aim to achieve a balance between adaptation and mitigation. And the Green Climate Fund is, aiming to have a 50-50 balance between adaptation and mitigation finance. On top of that, the Secretary General of the United Nations just recently called on countries and development partners to commit up to 50% of their climate finance to adaptation. So, the important point here is that, high-level commitments can bring much needed attention to the issue of the need for climate scaled up adaptation finance. Next slide. So what's happening to close the financing gap? We're going to look at sort of three issues: multilateral development banks, private sector, and what developing countries are doing. And I think it's important to point out that the MDBs are playing an important role. 9 MDBs have collectively committed to double the total level of adaptation financing provided to their clients. So to scale it up to 18 billion by 2025 from 2019. I think the World Bank is particularly a leader in this effect. It has a target of that 35% of its financing out to 2025 will have climate co-benefits, and half of that financing will support adaptation and resilience. The MDBs are moving towards this goal of scaling up adaptation finance through various means. And one of the big things they are doing is ensuring that their country strategies and their programmings accounts for the priorities set out by developing countries in their NAPs or in their NDCs. The banks respond to the needs and requests of developing countries, and these are very important documents and strategies that can direct MDB financing towards developing country priorities. Also important is that the MDBs have, many of the banks have improved their climate diagnostics, and screening for climate risks has become a standard procedure within the banks when they're developing projects. And many of the banks have teams of climate experts that help to improve how climate adaptation is being incorporated in design and implementation. And what we're seeing, this means that development finance is increasingly delivered in a climate and adaptation sensitive manner. We see that the MDBs have developed a methodology for tracking finance for adaptation. While it's not perfect, it continues to be improved. And we're generally all having a better understanding of financial flows for adaptation. And we're seeing MDBs move toward blended finance applications, although more of it is for mitigation. But definitely are working with countries to help build institutional capacity and the enabling environment to move towards more innovative type instruments. Next slide, please. When we talk about closing the adaptation finance gap, there's always discussion about the role of the private sector and the need to engage the private sector to address that gap. And governments can work in various ways to bring in the private sector. And one is to encourage the private sector to develop and supply the goods and services to build resilience and to build resilience within their operations. And this can be done through capacity building, so the provision of climate information, through standards and regulations, through challenge funds, loans, guarantees. And so there are various ways to encourage the private sector to begin to build resilience and to supply the goods that are needed to build resilience. Governments can also work to encourage private investment, and that's establishing the enabling environment, the regulatory framework. That includes identifying suitable adaptation projects to fund with private investment. For example, what types of projects might be suitable for a resilience to finance the resilience or green bond. But I think when we're talking about the private sector, it's important to recognize that there may be limited potential. Many adaptation investments are considered public goods that governments should and need to fund. So moving forward, there's a need to identify and first address sectors that have opportunity. So adaptation investment in certain infrastructure projects, for example, irrigation or wastewater management, they may be able to generate sufficient revenue or savings to make private investment profitable. But then there will be other projects with very weak or absent cash flows, such as seawalls, that are just generally unattractive to private investment. So going forward, governments need a realistic assessment of what is doable and what's the best use of their scarce public money to bring in private investment. And one area of research in our project is innovative financial instruments. We're developing an inventory of such instruments that can encourage private sector investment in engagement and adaptation. And Matt will speak to that a little more in our panel discussion. Next slide, please. So just wrapping up my opening comments, I'm just going to look at some of the actions or things that are taking place in developing countries. And I think we're all aware that mainstreaming adaptation in national planning and budgeting processes is critical. That includes, including adaptation in COVID-19 recovery programs. Many countries have NAPs or national adaptation plans, NDCs, adaptation financing strategies. And one thing we encourage is alignment and consistency across these strategies and, into SDG strategies or, more the broad economic environment. So standalone strategies are important. So it's important to understand adaptation, to understand the priorities, but it's also important that these adaptation financing strategies and adaptation plans are considered as part of the broader economic situations. If they remain standalone, they probably won't be taken up if they're brought into what's happening with the Ministry of Finance, for example, they're much greater chance for success and uptake. So that points to the importance of coordinated actions with an engagement of the ministries of finance. As we noted, government finance plays a large role in addressing the adaptation priorities in developing countries. Just to restate, it's important to build that capacity and technical expertise. It's important that you have effective stakeholder engagement, and particularly with subnational governments, which will finance and undertake many of the actions to address adaptation at the community level. And then my parting point will be that the need to use public, both domestic and international resources in a strategic manner. So governments need to consider, how do I best use domestic funds? How do I best use the grant funds and concessional loans that come in? How can these funds be used to attract private investment? Basically, where and how can a government ensure that use their funds to best address the adaptation gap? So basically, I'm going to wrap up here. I've tried to, I've presented some ideas and some lessons that are emerging from our research, and I encourage you to look at our webpage, to come back over the year as we publish our case studies, our research on adaptation finance strategies, and we develop our inventory of financial instruments. So I'd like to thank you for listening. And when we get to the open discussion, I'm really looking forward to hearing about your experiences and what you've been doing to address the adaptation finance gap. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Deborah, for setting out the challenges and the opportunities associated with scaling up finance for adaptation. That was great. So I'm sure that Deborah's presentation has raised ideas and questions within the audience. So if you have any comments or questions that you would like to share, please write them in Padlet, or remember to raise your hand during the open discussion. So with that, we'll now turn to our panel and dive a bit more deeply into actions and opportunities to use public sector finance in a targeted way to deliver country-defined adaptation priorities and, where possible, to crowd in private sector finance. I'd like to call on Andrew Hurst, who will moderate our panel discussion, as well as the open discussion session that will follow. Andrew is the Director of the Economic Growth and of the IISD Division, Global Affairs Canada. Andrew, we're pleased that you're able to join us today, and over to you.
Thanks, Anne, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar names on the participants list. Thanks to Idrc and IISD for asking me to moderate today's session. So we have a great panel today of people who will provide perhaps some reactions to Deborah's presentation and ground them from perspectives in whether it's in countries or from certain institutional perspectives. Each panel member that I will introduce shortly will have 5 minutes each to make some comments. So I'd ask panelists to just please keep an eye on the time so that we have enough time for all the panelists to comment, but also adequate time for questions, answers, and comments afterwards. If you, just as a reminder as well, when I turn to you as a panelist, if you could please turn your camera on so that everybody can see you. And for those participants who are following along and have questions, as they occur to you, feel free to post them in the chat or to use the Padlet app and site that has been provided to you. So let me first turn to Andrea Fonseca, who is a project manager at Libélula in Peru. Andrea will talk about Peru's public budget approach to financing adaptation. So Andrea, if I could ask you, you've got your camera on, great, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Can you hear me now? Yeah, good, thank you. Good day to everyone. It's a pleasure for me to share some insights about how Peru is including climate finance in the public budget. To begin, I will just give a bit overview of how it's going on in Peru, and then I will share some of the insights we gathered from the research. So currently, Peru is developing the financial strategy plan, the National Climate Finance Strategy. And by now, the guidelines for the finance strategy in Peru is guided by the Peruvian Climate Change Framework Law and its regulation that were published in 2018 and 2019. According to this regulation, climate change must be integrated in the public decisions at all government levels. That means that all sectoral authorities at national level, regional and local governments must incorporate climate risk vulnerability as well as the identification of mitigation and adaptation measures during the formulation and updating of policies, strategies, budget, and the investment planning instruments they have as well. This means that the cost for adaptation, cost for addressing adaptation for ensuring resilient investment must come from the institutional budget, and there will be no additional resources from the treasury. It's a way of mainstreaming adaptation into the public budget. Just to give some framework, in 2015, the first adaptation measures were developed for the NDC that were presented. And each sector that were relevant for the prioritized sectors of adaptation proposed mostly measures related to undergoing actions and strategies that were already in their plans, in their operational plans, which already had a public budget assigned. Thus, this ensured that some of the measures had already some budget to begin with. However, it's still needed to identify the financial gaps for implementing these measures, and consequently explore which financial instruments or mechanisms could be used to this end. In order to find this gap, it's needed an economic evaluation of these 91 measures. For this purpose, the MINAM has developed guidelines on how to do this assessment. These guidelines for making this economic evaluation is project-based, which means that they translate each measure into projects, which projects will be needed to be implemented for addressing the measure that was defined. And based on these projects that are identified, they look for already existing projects that were implemented in the past, and they kind of extrapolate based on certain measures. For example, if there's a project related to a measure where water reservoirs need to be constructed, they would look for water reservoirs investment before and see how much soles or dollars would be invested for each cubic meter that needs to be stored in these water reservoirs. That's kind of the methodology that was proposed by MINAM. So currently, there are 51 adaptation measures that have been evaluated, and the costs have been defined. However, the results are not public, but they will be published in the National Adaptation Plan. And the remaining 40 measures are being evaluated. Like the cost of these measures are being evaluated by the Ministry of Environment in a joint work with the Ministry of Finance. So the costing of these measures is really important to see where to invest and what are the gaps that are needed to fill, and which are the best instruments for addressing the implementation of these measures. Thus, it's clear that there has been some progress, even though the law and regulation are quite new, 2018 and 2019. However, there's still a long way to go to complement the mandates, to make sure the mandates from this law is implemented. Some challenges we have identified are that although the project costing for adaptation measure is significant, there's a good progress, information availability and open access to it is crucial for funding, either from MDBs, private or public sources. Thus, the challenge is to socialize the financial analysis of the total 91 measures within the ministries involved, and to make information open access, especially for potential investors, because by now there's no clarity on what's needed to be invested and where is it the priorities that should be focused. A second challenge we identify is that even though the 91 measures were developed within the ministries, the relevant ministries, they were conducted by external contractors just for this end. Furthermore, the efforts for MINAM during the NAP process was remarkable. The multi-sectoral focus and integrated work factors are factors to be reinforced, because there is the challenge still that of a better exchange of information between MINAM and the other sectors involved in the NAP, so they can actually internalize the importance of climate finance and creative adaptation projects. Now it's more like MINAM pushing to it. It's needed that each sector internalize and takes as their own these adaptation projects and measures. Another challenge is that, considering the importance of the private sector in the NAP implementation, MINAM, which is the Ministry of Environment, and MEFEC, which is the Ministry of Finance, have the challenge of producing information in business terms that demonstrates the return to the investment. Currently, there is a lack of common language between the government and the private sector, as well as limited shared understanding of the business model and the priority of adaptation projects. So the challenge is to produce clear data on the costs, returns, and gains for the private sector to invest in the NAP in the implementation. Another challenge, I'm out of time, I don't know here. Okay.
Yeah. If you could just wrap up, that would be great, thanks.
Yeah, I will just wrap up. So, well, we expect that the climate finance strategy that is being developed can ground easier, like can make more clear, like which are the needs of investment and which are the potential source for each of the measures that are identified. So to make this is really important to finish the evaluation cost of each measure, and also to translate it into terms that are useful for also private sector and MDBs as well. Okay, thank you.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Very interesting perspectives from initiatives and efforts ongoing in Peru. So now if I could turn the floor over to Jackson Wachira, who is joining us from Kenya. He is with the African Center for Technology Studies, and we are going to hear a little bit about how ACTS has been encouraging MDB investments in Kenya that are aligned with national adaptation priorities. Jackson, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And I'm also happy to join this very interesting conversation. And yeah, as our colleagues in Peru, we have also been working with IISD to try and understand how the multilateral development banks are supporting adaptation and mitigation endeavors for developing countries like Kenya. And we certainly have obtained quite interesting findings in the last year or so. And so for me, perhaps just to start with a bit of a context around the fact that Kenya remains a leader in the African continent as far as designing policy frameworks to manage climate change is concerned. We've got the Climate Change Act of 2016, which is a first of its kind in the continent, and a plethora of other policies, and including the climate change action plans and the just revised nationally determined, the NDC, which was revised from the ambition of reducing greenhouse gas emissions from 30 to 32% just last year. So so that's the context within which the country is currently with. And also another, I think, very important context is the fact that the country has a good history working with the multilateral development banks since the 1960s. So I think that's a very important context. So what we're finding in our work is that as the country continues to adjust towards combating climate change, that evolution is happening alongside the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank, endeavor to also mainstream climate change adaptation into their development finance. And a very classic example is a realization that, for instance, the World Bank funded a very innovative project in Kenya on commercialized access to water in the late 2000s, and there wasn't much to talk about climate change then. But when we've talked with a whole lot of stakeholders, they really think that that is a climate change adaptation project, even if it was not mentioned as such. So we're finding sort of an evolution alongside the country's ambitions and the bank's ambitions to combat climate change. And that, of course, within the banks has been happening in the context of the development of the country position papers and partnership papers that, according to the the stakeholders we've talked with, are quite participatory, with having the bank and the government officials involving or getting involved in that process through the specific development of the specific policies and policy tools such as the NAP and the NDC. And of course, we find that there is a feeling, particularly from the government, that can be improved. But at least it's supporting the country to invest in its climate adaptation endeavors. So what we have also found is the fact that there seems to be an alignment. We still need much more data, but there seems to be an alignment in terms of the balance between the adaptation and mitigation endeavors. We know that traditionally mitigation investments have attracted much more investment, so to say, by the virtue of the fact that they are easier to make a business case for. But when we look at the data from the distributed climate finance data from the banks, it seems to be speaking to a shift towards equitable financing of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And indeed, some of the banks like the AFDB has really asserted the fact that mitigation it's very important, but adaptation for countries like Kenya, as it is really envisaged in the country policy papers, remains a priority for the bank, and therefore we are likely to find a parity between climate change and mitigation, if not now, in the very near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackson. Right on time to the second. Appreciate that very much. So we have next, and I should say it's great to hear as well the evolving conversation with the banks. We know that the World Bank is committed to 50-50 split between adaptation and mitigation, and the AFDB is going through its own climate policy framework review in real time now. So we'll be very curious to see the commitments that come out of them as well. So I'd like to give the floor now to Raju Pandit Shetri, who's the Executive Director of the Prakriti Resources Center in Nepal. Raju, very much cognizant of the fact that things in Nepal are very difficult right now with COVID, and so we do appreciate you very much taking the time to join us today. So Raju will highlight Nepal's challenges in attracting private finance for adaptation. Over to you, Raju.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I hope you all can hear me well, and namaste to everyone from Kathmandu. Good to be speaking in this program today. Well, PRC has been a part of this study that along with IISD and Idrc, we've been taking this forward. And just to highlight more on the part of the private sector financing, currently Nepal is going through a lot of policy formulation processes in the current setting that Nepal just submitted its NDCs to the UNFCCC, and also it's currently formulating national adaptation plans. But apart from that, there are also climate change policies and other processes in place. This is primarily because the climate change issue has been a major issue here. And there's been a lot of effort to attract financing, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, and also from the NDBs. And there's been a lot of strategies being discussed about, and how can this be accessed, and especially to finance our NDCs or to the adaptation plans that is being put in place. And this, well, we're talking about this Green Climate Fund and various other funds that exist. How can publicly that money can be accessed by public institutions, but at the same time also national private sectors can play a role, whether it through innovative sources or through process that where there are opportunities to work with MDBs and other international dedicated climate funds and so on and so forth. But then now the climate finance, the climate adaptation has been very much focused with the public sectors or organizations that are not, private in nature, because in a country like ours, the private sector itself is very evolving. It's still building. I mean, it's developing. But then again, when you talk about private sector, we can also look into two fronts, that you look at the big organizations, big institutions, and private firms, but at the same time, community-based, private organizations that are really working on the ground with smaller capitals and doing activities related to agriculture and many other things. But now, in order to attract bigger adaptation funds by the private sector, it has been a huge challenge on two fronts. One, we have very limited private sectors that can actually foresee what the climate impacts are really bringing and how they can really intervene in. I think that level of knowledge and that awareness is very low. We have done this exercise with various, with FNCCI here, that is the Federation of Industries here and Commerce here. But then we find it very unattractive for the private sector, basically because it does not attract profit. And that's because we have problems like either lowering the glacial lakes in the Himalayas or building, addressing climate-induced disasters such as floodings and landslide and things like that. So that's not very attractive for them to invest, and there's no return on that. That's what the expectation is, that even by the communities, the government will support. So that expectation is very huge. On the other side, I think we have also failed to really aware the politicians who can see from that and champion on climate change, and then really bring on these policies and processes that encourage the diverse sectors to invest and also look from this perspective. I think that is also a little bit lacking on our side. Having said that, one of the things that attempts are there, like, Asian Development Bank is working to integrate climate change and adaptation so that they can see certain sectors going forward through, also encouraging a private sector. For instance, IFC, International Finance Corporation, has started using some kind of innovative instruments to attract, the private sector, especially in the agriculture sector. They have worked with farmers that are especially growing sugarcane, for instance, to make a more resilient sugarcane farming. Because if the sugarcane fails, the sugarcane factories are also going to fail. So that's how the agro businesses that is linked to the value chain, that is linked to the businesses, this attempt to do that. Somewhere they also attempt now already in the Himalayas, where the apples are being grown, where companies are coming in to invest and also insure their crops, whether it's livestock or apples and other products. So this is a good start that we can see coming forward. But in the current structures, there's very limited incentives, I would say, even for the private sectors to come in. And when you talk about plans like, adaptation plans or NDCs, we do say that there is a need for the private sector to actually move forward. But then how do we incentivize them? I think that policy front is very, very low. We do see attraction in the mitigation sector, whether it's energy or transportation. That is a quite good sector for them because they see profit coming in. But in the adaptation sector, if you have to deal with the community people, we have to deal with extreme events like the floodings or landslides or drought. I think there is a very less chance that they see coming in. There's attempt, as I said, being made, but I think it's very, very slow, very gradual. That awareness level and that work still has to be done. It's quite a lot of work that we need to work towards that direction, from at least that I see from Nepal, and having interacted with various stakeholders under this research studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raju, for that. Those very interesting perspectives from Peru, and for keeping time as well. So lastly, I'd like to turn to Matthew Goeth, who's a Sustainable Finance Advisor in the Economic Law and Policy Program at IISD. Matt is going to talk a little bit about innovative financial instruments as a means to increase finance for adaptation. So over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, so briefly, I just want to talk about kind of recapitulating some of the things that Deborah brought up in her presentation with regards to the significant challenges that are still facing efforts to scale up adaptation and specifically attracting private finance. So I think to set the conversation a little bit, we can think about that there's what I see as three main challenges. First, I think this challenge that Deborah had brought up about revenue streams. Private investors, they want to be repaid, preferably with some interest or equity growth. And we know that adaptation projects tend to have less clear revenue streams, especially in the early stages. Again, Deborah had highlighted, these are long-term projects. Another specific thing that we haven't necessarily heard much about today, but there is a lot of idiosyncratic risk when it comes to these type of projects. This is not necessarily just an adaptation issue, but when an investor is investing in maybe one or two projects, it's far riskier than investing in a larger platform of projects. Obviously, we know that investors want diversified portfolios. So this is something for us to keep in mind when we're having a conversation about the actual financial mechanisms that we're thinking could be adapted to adaptation financing. And then finally, I wanted to touch upon the challenges with respects to reporting on impacts. And I just wanted, it really struck me in the conversation that Deborah was having, and something that I wanted to highlight was that while we see a greater focus on the greening of investment portfolios from private actors, we are starting to see some standardized approaches to reporting. Specifically, because a lot of the financing has been driven towards mitigation, we see a lot of metrics around jobs being created, GHG emissions being avoided, the number of people with increased access to electricity. And what strikes me is that even an organization such as the Adaptation Fund, it reports on the number of beneficiaries of their projects or their funding, or it looks at the number of people trained, or the meters of coastline protected. And while these are important metrics, if you're an investor and you are already capturing metrics and reporting to your investees on one set of metrics, having these metrics that are not necessarily aligned with what you've been reporting on in the past is an unforeseen barrier, or it could be a barrier to entry. So with this in mind, what are some of the financial mechanisms that we see as innovative that we think could overcome some of these challenges? And what I see and what we've seen in the literature is, or a way forward, is really this idea of how are we going to aggregate projects. Basically, what we're seeing and what we're thinking about at IISD is, how do you aggregate revenue generating projects with maybe some adaptation projects that might not have these clear revenue streams into what we would call investable packages. So for example, we know that there's been an explosion in the green bond market issuances in the past 5 years. And as Deborah had alluded to, with COVID-19 striking the past year and a half at this point, there's been a significant uptake in sustainability financing, and sustainability bonds. So could the proceeds from these bonds be used to fund adaptation projects alongside, let's say, green buildings or renewable energy projects, or in the case of sustainability bonds, possibly affordable housing? So again, this idea of aggregating projects together so that you would have a bit of a balance between these revenue generating projects and, again, these projects that might not have the clearest revenue paths that we see forward. Another way to think about this idea of aggregation, and something that we might be a little bit more familiar with, are investment facilities that pool investor funds. So traditionally, we've thought about these as blended fund facilities. So examples in the climate side has been Climate Investor One. With regards to adaptation, there is the Acumen and Resilient Agriculture Fund that was supported by the GCF. These essentially, obviously, these are funds that blend private and public finance. But I think it's important for us to think about going forward that there's nothing that requires this not to be completely privately funded. And what I mean by that is we're seeing a far greater focus in the private sector with regards to equity funds and private equity wanting to report on climate and climate impacts. So I think in the future, we do think that there's going to be more there and more openness to money coming into this sector. Hopefully some of that money will come towards adaptation. Again, with this idea of another thing that we've seen of late is in this idea of aggregation is the aggregation of portfolios in the securitization sector. So AFDB in 2018 announced its Room to Run initiative, which was a synthetic securitization whereby it actually securitized part of its portfolio. Again, this gives an investor a portfolio of projects that is already performing and is already revenue generating, and allows a private investor to then invest in something that they know that there's going to be a return. So with that being said, this idea of aggregation is very, very important. Borrowing from some of the folks at Convergence, the other thing to think about when it comes to innovative financing mechanisms is how to adjust the risk and return characteristics of adaptation projects. And this is probably where public finance is going to be far more important going forward. And just some mechanisms that we probably already know a lot about, but we think could probably be used more frequently in the future are ideas of credit enhancements such as guarantees, liquidity facilities for early stage development of projects, local currency hedging mechanisms such as the TCX platform. These are going to be very, very important going forward. We know, looking at the literature and talking with certain donors and DFIs and organizations, that there is a varied relationship between these actors and the usage of these facilities. There's obviously certain risk characteristics that some of these actors are not necessarily comfortable with, but it is important that this is how we're going to get private finance into the game. Unfortunately, with sometimes though, with certain projects, if there's no financial return, it really doesn't matter how you adjust the risk. It's going to have to be a certain amount of grant funding that's going to get those projects over the curb, if you know kind of what I'm saying with regards to that. So finally, yeah, closing, I just wanted to close up. So in closing, I just wanted to mention, I've mentioned very, very briefly a couple of the financial mechanisms that we're looking into as part of this project. I just want to highlight for everyone that this fall we will be rolling out a website which will have far more details on all of these. We would definitely like you to visit if you're if you're interested in learning more, and always please reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks Matt for that, and thanks to all our panelists. I realized there was a lot of information covered in Deborah's presentation, and a lot of issues that have been put on the table. So we've got a good number of questions that have come in already. So perhaps if I can start, there's two country-specific questions. The first is to Andrea on the Peruvian case. And just in the event that not all of you are signed into Padlet, I'll just summarize the question quickly. So how have government departments reacted to the impetus to pay for adaptation measures they identify using their own resources? You know, this in a context obviously where they face competing demands. How are they reacting to these requirements as opposed to other options that might be more politically attractive? So just that's the one question. And then for Jackson, there's a question on the Kenyan case. We're seeing lots of climate funds flowing to mitigation, while the Kenyan NDC is obviously adaptation focused, like many developing countries. How can we realign the country to direct funding to more funding to adaptation? So first to you, Andrea, and then to Jackson.
Thank you, Andrew. Just to answer this question, I have to pinpoint a couple of issues. So most of the measures that were suggested at the beginning were in their operational plans of the sectors. So they already had some kind of budget, and some of these measures were not that clear. So they are not easily translated into project investment, and it's not even clear because there are some things that have to be invested at national level by the sectors and at regional or local level by the regional and local governments. So by now, there's not much reaction because it's not clear how much money is needed to be invested. That's why they are making like this evaluation of the cost of each measure to see, okay, which sector should invest what and which regional or local government should invest on what. So by now, each sector or local government or regional government have not been kind of directly addressed, or they have not shown any concern. I guess once the quantification of the costs for this implementation, for the adaptation measures will be maybe an issue, but we talked already with a couple of the main sectors that have to implement measures, like the Water National Authority. And in their case, they know, okay, most of the things that they propose there in the measures are part of what they're already doing. So there's not much issue on that. But incorporating more and make it mainstream, that's a challenge. And for that, the Ministry of Environment is investing in developing technical abilities and also internalizing this idea of including climate change in the investment within the ministries. And also one thing that the law also says is that a Ministry of Environment and Ministry of Finance will help and provide technical support for governments, regional and national governments, and also private sectors and even private institutions, indigenous groups, to access to climate financing. So also we hope that that can help reduce like this risk of prioritizing like their limited resources.
Great, thanks for that. Jackson, over to you. A question on how to get more finance in Kenya flowing into adaptation versus mitigation.
Jackson seemed to.
Johannes, would you like to speak
Jackson
to
seemed to have jumped out, but I can quickly give some thoughts. I think one, it's very true that Kenyan NDC is adaptation focused. And one of the things that we also realized in the analysis is the fact that one of the impediments to getting MDB support to adaptation is the lack of institutionalized models for engaging the MDB. So in terms of preparing some of these plans, including the NDC, so you find that, for instance, in the case of Kenya, the process actually happens in isolation without proper sort of consultation with the funding sources, whether MDBs or private sector. Now, what this creates is that there is some lack of harmony between the country plans around the vision and the passion of the country and the perspectives or the passion or the interest of the MDB, the funders, whether MDBs or the private sector. So at the end of the day, you realize that whilst Kenya, we have the adaptation focus, there is very limited space to be able to really link that particular aspiration to the funding mechanism. So one of the ways, I don't have the answers to this, but certainly in this discussion, we could have some perspective. So one of the ways would be to have some institutionalized engagements between the country agencies that are mandated to prepare these plans and the funders in terms of the sources of funding, whether MDBs, private sector, or other multilateral sources. So once that institutionalized approach, what that would mean is that there would be some synergy in terms of aspirations. And if, for instance, Kenya would like to focus more on adaptation, then upfront there will be some commitment from these funders to support this particular process. So, but at the moment it's a bit ad hoc. So that brings some imbalance. But certainly there's many more to be done. Thanks.
Thank you, Johannes. And feel free, all panelists, to keep your cameras on. So the next question I will, it's a general one, and I'll turn to perhaps each of you in turn to speak to it. And that is the necessary focus in talking about climate adaptation finance in bringing in the question of gender. So essentially the question is, how do we integrate gender lens or gender responsive investment parameters into the already difficult challenge of promoting greater flows of finance into adaptation? So perhaps I can start by turning that to Raju, and then I'll ask Matt.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. Well, just two things. One on the other, there was a question about the flow of the finance in overall for the adaptation. Well, I mean, it's a very skewed number from the global levels. I think that is going to reflect at the country level as well. And especially for smaller or low capacitated countries that cannot compete with the other bigger countries, I think that's always going to be very disadvantaged. Anyway, now, almost the ratio is like 30-70 of the total climate finance, 30 going to adaptation. So it's already very skewed. In addition to that, it's very much difficult for low capacitated countries. Well, on the case of gender, well, I think it's a very important aspect currently, because now there's a lot of work being done in terms of looking that the women are being also are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change than compared to the other people. Basically, because when you come from a country like ours, that we already see those elements where women have to do the household work, or they rely on agricultural activities. So their effort to make that, there is this gender inclusion in every adaptation actions that is going forward. For instance, I can say that the ministry, climate change that looks after climate change in Nepal, is making a gender policy, or let's say the strategic plan to incorporate the gender aspect into the adaptation work. It has a very identified area in the national climate change policy. It is a very specific group of working group made in the NAP process, for instance. Even now, the good thing is, even when you write project proposals to agencies like Green Climate Fund, they ask you, they have a gender policy, they ask you to follow the gender policy very strictly, not just follow it, but they ask you to actually identify the problems, make a strategy to implement it, and then also budget it. So I think this is a very important aspect, that you look from the design part to, in fact, making an action plan to implement it, and then budgeting it. And later, of course, that is followed by monitoring and evaluation. I think that this is a good aspect that is going forward. But I think, again, gender is an issue that is country-based and context-based, where different people have different interpretation about it. But I think it seems at least there's a lot to do, at least even in our country. But we seem to be moving in a good direction. Hope that what we have designed can be implemented, actually.
Thank you, Raju. Matt, any perspectives on some of the innovative financing approaches that you've laid out, and how well or not they integrate gender perspectives?
Yeah, generally speaking, I think in a lot of what we're seeing is there is a bit of a shift right now going on, especially in the bond market, with whether it be green bonds or the explosion of sustainability bonds, that we are seeing gender considerations that are being considered in those bonds. And we're actually, as part of our work at IISD, sometimes we provide second opinions on green bond frameworks, and that is something that we definitely focus on, asking the issuer how they are integrating gender into their framework. What we see we actually see this gender integration as really as part of the future, because what it does is, for the issuer, it opens up the market for them. So they have an incentive, not just morally, but also obviously economically, to bring more investors to the table by really highlighting how their green financing or their sustainability financing is going to improve the lives of women.
Thanks, Matt. Andrea or Johannes, any perspectives from Peru and Kenya, respectively, on addressing gender equality policy objectives through adaptation plans and finance? Andrea?
Yeah, I just wanted to highlight that actually in Peru, climate change is addressed, like all the strategies for adaptation, mitigation, and everything have these transversal integrated approaches, and one is gender. And actually, Peru has an action plan on how gender should be addressed for climate change. So in Peru, it's an important issue because the gender gap is, there's a lot of work to be done there. Actually, gender violence, it's one of the major issues in Peru as well. So yeah, for us, it's a big topic that is addressed. Also, like identifying how climate change might affect differently women or men. For example, in this plan, they state which actions should be taken to ensure that women can also be included in decision making for the management of the forests, for example. No, so it is a relevant issue in Peru. However, it's still hard to try to make it mainstream. You know, there's like the MINAM itself, like the Ministry of Environment, has a strong commitment to it, but it's hard still to transmit it to all of the sectors where it has to be implemented. But yeah, it is a relevant issue for this matter.
Thanks, Johannes. Any perspectives from Kenya, either on MDB?
No,
MDB
from my side, I think,
otherwise?
yeah, I think most of the points have been well addressed by the colleagues. But I just wanted to emphasize the fact that adaptation is basically socially constructed because it's more of the social processes. So that means gender should be basically at the center of things. But I think the way gender has been approached in these particular processes, and especially what we see in Kenya, has been a little bit abstract. So we focus on gender based on HR, human resource numbers. And of course, Kenya has this particular rule called the 2/3 gender rule. So it's just about the numbers, not about the content. So I think there is need to do much more around the content of the plans beyond the numbers. Thanks.
Yeah, great point about the need to go beyond the targets and numbers. So just a note, this was originally supposed to wrap up at in about 3 minutes, but I've agreed with IISD and Idrc that we will extend it for another 15 minutes or so. So we probably have another time for a few more questions. I have one that's already been posed, and so if there's any others who want to add one last question, either put your hand up in Zoom or put your question in the chat. The next question I would put, and again, maybe I'll turn to Matt first on this, but welcome others to chime in as well. And that is that there's obviously expectation for, we're going to see a big increase in carbon, the market for carbon credits and markets for ecosystem services. And that these are going to be revenue generating opportunities, both for public and private sector. The question is, how can we get ahead of these market changes and integrate these revenue opportunities into the kinds of advice that that are being provided to advice and support that it's being provided to developing countries? So perhaps Matt, if you can start us off by speaking to that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that we see from IISD's perspective and the sustainable finance work that we do is the proper valuation of that. We know that there's quite a bit of work going on by numerous organizations to assess the natural capital of a country and put proper valuations on kind of what ecosystem services benefits can deliver. It's part of the work that we do through our Savvy assessments at IISD, where we will look at specific projects, or we're now doing a very in-depth projects with the GEF on nature-based infrastructure and looking at specific projects and focusing on what are the externalities that really should be counted towards an NBI solution. So I think at the outset, while we know that there will be this influx of funding coming, it's very, very important that developing countries are very stringent and have a rigorous way of valuing what it is that their ecosystems are worth, so that they are not that they kind of go in on the right footing with as investment comes in and it looks to kind of put more money towards adaptation and mitigation solutions in these countries.
Thanks, Matt. Any of the other panelists want to chime in on this one?
Well, maybe I will just point out, because actually one of the case studies for workstream 3 in Peru is based on some kind of ecosystem payment mechanism, more but payment is like compensation mechanism. And Peru is actually focusing and trying to see how to connect better these mechanisms for financing adaptation, because by now they were just for development or conservation of nature. So it's, I think one of the main challenges for linking these to adaptation is that there are really limited resources in these mechanisms now, in Peru at least. And most of the funds are used for implementation of the projects itself. But in order to make it more like adaptation suitable, it has to be like the results needs monitoring, right? Like they need to measure like how is it implementing. And usually these are, monitoring is like also the costs are high for this. So this is, I think, one of the challenges on how to make sure the money that we have for these mechanisms can be used for the project itself, but also to show the results on how this contributes to adaptation. And I think that's one of the challenges, well, at least in Peru, we're facing. Monitoring is really, it's not that, we still have a lot of work to do there.
Johannes or Raju, any reflections or examples from Kenya? No, or Peru? Or sorry, Nepal? No. Okay. So I noticed that apparently Kerry Max has his hand up. I saw your comment in the chat, Kerry, but maybe you could reformulate it as a question for our panelists.
Absolutely. Can you hear me? Okay,
yep.
Great. So this last question, I think, highlights a category of adaptation that is very much part and parcel of what private investors might be looking to do. And I guess what I'm going to suggest is this has been a fantastic opportunity to talk about the broad challenges of adaptation finance and addressing these issues, but it's time to now differentiate between adaptation responses that can be connected to private revenues and private provision, and those responses that are very important as global public goods, but will never have a private revenue stream, because those are incredibly important, and there's a high risk of what I term in the Padlet document as an equality gap that will create an adaptation where all money will go to private response adaptation and will ignore the needs of people who are just getting by in terms of livelihoods, will ignore health and education needs, will ignore resiliency needs of the poorest and most vulnerable. And then the other side of that is, I think it's very important to point out that there's a very high overlap between what climate adaptation needs are on the ground and what day-to-day development needs are on the ground, especially with regards to food systems or disaster risk responses or things like that. And maybe the problem we have here is we're lost in translation. We're imposing this climate language as opposed to taking a look at what are the needs on the ground that clearly align with climate adaptive and resilient responses, and looking to create a portfolio of opportunities to address there. So question to all of you is where do you see some really strong overlap between the stuff that has huge local buy-in because it's the day-to-day reality that's being lived, but isn't necessarily being expressed as climate adaptation? Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry. Maybe Raju, I saw you nodding. Could I turn to you first?
Yes, well, that's quite interesting, Kerry, that you put the perspective. Let me give you with an example. For instance, in Nepal, what has been done is now there's a very big attempt to, in fact, integrate development initiatives and climate change adaptation work. That is precisely coming from the policy that we adopt, and there is something that Nepal has agreed to, a framework called Local Adaptation Plans for Action. So it's called LAPA, Local Adaptation Plans for Action, which in fact coincide with the development planning process and integrating the climate cycle into that. I mean, let's say the climate planning cycle into that. So it means it is done at the local level by the local authorities. When they do their annual planning, they also consider climate change into that. There's already a vulnerability assessment and risk assessment done, and that is how the integration is done. So that there could be a separate pot of money going to address those activities that has been designed in their plan for adaptation action. I think this has been we have done this for quite a few cycles already. There's a very good learning coming from this, and there are also other countries learning from this. So I think this is a good way that you start on the ground, because as you very rightly said, whether the people are facing in normal situation food insecurity because of not having a proper irrigation system, or it is because of the drought that the communities are facing, a problem with irrigation. So they could be either way. But then at the end of the day, it is the communities that has to benefit. But where does the really difference come is, where is the finance coming from? Whether you talk that it's a normal finance that flows to address those, or you're addressing it from a climate financing perspective, a climate and adaptation financing perspective. I think that is where it has to be clear. Of course, the community is integrated. So at the end, it will be integrated work. But the source of financing that comes, is it the national public finance is it coming? Is it international development aid that is coming? Or is it the international climate finance that is coming? I think that has to be very clear. In order to do that, the system needs to be very clear how we account that amount. Thank you.
Joannis or Andrea, any points you want to
Maybe
make?
I can comment a bit on that, because as I mentioned before, in Peru, we're trying to make it integrated, right? So in theory, each regional government, local government, in their development plans, they should incorporate vulnerability and risk assessments. So the idea is that, of course, these issues that must be addressed by, like, it's for development, that we won't, it's really hard to link it to private investment. Should be clear what should be invested by the public sector. And in order to do that, the Ministry of Environment has already developed, for example, some guidelines how to incorporate environment, like climate and vulnerability risks for the development of water irrigation or water sanitation projects, for the investment projects. So that's a way to incorporate these and make sure like development projects include the adaptation part. And on the other part that you commented, of course, this is the thing that should be invested by the public budget, that there's also things that can be financed by the private sector. And sometimes they have like these interlinks or intertwined, like there's like, for example, just to give an example, some of the adaptation measures in Peru are related to improving the technical capacities of farmers, for example, to adapt better to the changes on climate and to improve their chain of value. So at the beginning, to provide this technical assistance can come from the government, right? Like to help them to improve their services. But once these farmers have more capacities and their agriculture and the products are like of better quality, this can link maybe to other private investors to be part of this chain of value. So I think it's important, and that's why we think it's really important that this strategy, the national strategy, climate finance strategy plan, includes like this clarity on which are the investment needed and who should do these investments. So there will be easier to see, okay, for these kind of measures, we need to address where maybe the development banks or maybe the national governments, because it's within their funds, or find the gaps. And these should be for private sector. So let's try to make these investments more attractive for the private sector as well. So yeah, that's part of the suggestions we're having. We don't know still how the strategy is going, because it's kind of still under development, but we hope this strategy can provide this clarity in Peru.
Joannis, reflections from Kenya on this question?
I think most things have been said, but my reflection would go to the proposal to have differentiated adaptation measures into those which are commercially viable and those which are socially, rather public good viable, which is a great idea, I think, because the element of the viability of adaptation in terms of financing, especially from the private sector and the returns, is a major issue and is a major concern for not only Kenya, but the entire Africa and most developing countries. So that is a very interesting perspective. The only thing, or the only concern that might also, might think about is that, where would this then leave a number of other socially significant adaptation measures, which are really aligned to the needs of the poor local communities who are vulnerable? Are we going to usher in new power relations in the adaptation sphere, where we are going to have everybody running to the commercially viable adaptation options, and then sort of neglecting the really very socially important options that are really critical in addressing the needs of the poor. So those are some of the questions, because look at a country like Kenya, where a lot of the adaptation measures that are being pursued are socially important. They might not have that commercial viability, but 80% of the population or 70% of the population living in the rural areas are really very, highly impacted by the impacts of climate change. People are losing productivity. People are going hungry, and the extent to which we can commercialize adaptation equitably is something that perhaps we need to look at or interrogate much more deeply. Of course, depending on the context. I think there is a lot of dynamics within the adaptation sphere that still needs a lot of answers. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Some great points. Maybe I'll just give the last opportunity to Matt to come in onto this. Given that many innovative finance tools are actually looking to push the private sector into spaces that have social impact. Matt, is there anything from the work you've done, you can add to the comments so far?
No, I think the comments have been, and I think especially the focus that Jonas had brought up with respect to, that, it's important that while we want to encourage private finance to come into these spaces, we don't necessarily want them, I think it would be unfair for us to say to governments that only we just want the good projects for the private finance companies, because then again, you're in a situation where, you could be starting to affect government revenues and other, there's other follow-on effects that could come from that. The one thing that I would say to Kerry's point, and while I understand what he's saying with regards to, we're so focused on focusing on how much money is going to climate adaptation, if we start looking at other, let's say, whether it be donor capital or DFI investment into other sectors and start counting that as climate adaptation, do we get away from this idea that we need a certain amount of additional dollars that go into adaptation? We've been fairly clear that we are not meeting the gap as it sits right now. I worry that if we start, let's say, tagging certain agriculture projects, or we start tagging certain, other projects that are have been, let's say, traditionally donor funded as being adaptation, it gives us the false impression that we're doing more than what we actually are.
Great. Okay. Well, I'm afraid that's probably all the time we have now for Q&A. Thanks very much to the panelists. And I'm going to turn it back over to Anne now to wrap things up.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much for the conversation. It looks like that is all the time we have for today's questions. And so I'd like to thank Andrew for moderating the discussion with our panel members and participants. And if we were not able to get to your question today, I want to encourage you to reach out to my team by email at resilience@iisd.ca to follow up on anything we missed. You can find the email address in the chat box as well as on the screen here. Before we close today, I'd like to ask Bim Adhikari, who's the Senior Program Specialist at IDRC, to provide some closing comments. Over to you, Bim.
Thanks, Anne. So I think, a lot of rich discussion today. So I don't think that I'll be able to summarize whatever we have been discussing last 1.5 hours. But just to give express our sincere thanks to all our partners from Nepal, Peru, and Kenya as well. And one quick thing I would like to mention about the, very country level, a specific type of, adaptation kind of intervention I think this country are doing. Like Peru, we have this cost benefit kind of, of the different adaptation options. That is most needed because country really need to know, how much they need to kind of address the adaptation challenges in the particular country. There's a very unique one from Peru. And Nepal, we have the local adaptation action plan, which is basically tried to kind of combine the local development priority and the climate needs as well. I think that's kind of very unique as well. And from Kenya, I think there's some interesting insight as well, because most of the time when you say NDC, we talk about a mitigation kind of side only. But I think many of these NDCs, particularly coming from the least developed country, I think there is a huge adaptation component there as well. So that's kind of very interesting kind of intervention from Joanne as well. And Carrie's, I think, Carrie Mack's point about how we could really go about kind of enticing the local climate needs and development needs, and how we go about really kind of packaging those action at the local level. So that is also kind of a very interesting kind of point. And then my last one was a gender lens investment, because this is still a very big challenge. I think how we go about really having the gender lens kind of climate investment. So anyway, I think there's a very good discussion. So we'll be taking some of these issues further, because we still have about a year or so left within the project timeline. So I'm sure that these are the very helpful comments. And thanks again, I think on behalf of IDRC, I would like to thank all of our partners, and we're really looking to our further engagement. Thanks. Over to you, Anne.
Great, thanks so much. And I'd just like to echo what Bim said. I'd like to thank Andrew, Deborah, and our panel members for sharing their time, expertise, and insights with us. And I'd also like to thank the audience for their engagement and inputs. We've recorded today's event and we'll be posting it along with a presentation on our website. We'll send you a follow-up email with more information in the days to come. And so with that, thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.